Nathan and Krista, most of us know them as longtime BASK members, very, very active. But many don't know that they've done a lot of paddling all over the world in amazing places. And they're going to be telling us tonight about their recent trip to Greece, which I learned all about kayaking or small boat navigating in Greece in 5th grade when I did a report on Homer's Odyssey. And so I'm looking forward to hearing about sirens and dangerous rocks and giant whirlpools. So don't disappoint me, please. Nathan and Krista.
Yep, can you see our screen?
Yeah.
Okay, can you see the slide? It says Circumnavigating Milos. Is that the largest thing?
I'm seeing a slide about Milos in Greece. Slide 1 of 65.
All right, switch it back.
We're seeing a presenter notes.
Okay, how about now? The screen is mostly black? Okay.
Yes.
Sorry, Nathan managed to confuse me there. Okay, can you hear us okay?
It's good.
All right. Nathan, want to take it away? Or
Yeah.
You're eating?
So what? It's a cookie. Let a man have a cookie. So Milos is not just, it is an island in Greece, and it is a really cool place to go paddling. We went there with a couple of other BASKers and a couple of other folks. We wanted to do this presentation because we think it's actually, despite the distance, it's very accessible to a very large number of paddlers and a wide variety of paddling skills. So we wanted to give you some insight as to what it's like. I think a lot of people in the club might have been to like Italy with Barbara Cossi and stuff like that. And we think this is an underrated destination that's pretty cool. So that's what we're going to talk about. So Milos is in the Aegean Sea. The Ionian Sea is on the is in between Greece and Italy. And the Aegean is actually pretty shallow, as you can see from the bathymetry there. And Milos is in an island group called the Cyclades. It forms this kind of volcanic arc through the Aegean Sea. So everything you're going to see in our photographs was created through volcanic activity. So this volcanic arc also includes the islands of Santorini, Kos, as well as Poros on the mainland. And it's basically where the Eurasian plate is. The boundary of the Eurasian plate is very, very nearby, and which is subducting. Sorry, the African plate is subducting underneath the Eurasian plate. So that's why this area got a lot going on volcanically. So we were going to do this trip in 2020, and then pandemic. So we went with Lisa, Rohe, and Brian Alger, and 2 of Lisa's friends who live in Scotland. So we had a group of 6 total. We went with an outfitter called Sea Kayak Milos, and its founder is a geologist named Dave from Australia.
What? No, Rod.
Rod from Australia. And we had English couple as our guides, Dave and Sue Watson. And what was really unusual about this trip was that it was really, really affordable. It was incredibly reasonable compared to any other outfitters in the region. And imagine our surprise when we go to the boat shed and there are dolphins and Nordcaps and Greenland paddles that we could rent. They offer really, really good gear. And so you'll see Krista and I like in Wilderness Systems boats because we were doing an expedition and we needed the room to store camping gear. But yeah, would recommend.
Okay, so Milos is actually a fairly tiny island. It's only about 58 square miles, and it has 78 miles of coastline, but it's jam-packed with fascinating and beautiful geological features. And the 2 main factors in the formation of Milos are the volcanic blasts, which covered it with enormously thick layers of ash, and then the opening and closing of the Mediterranean throughout the ages. And the volcanoes that formed it are now considered extinct, but there's considerable geothermal activity remaining there.
So we started and ended our trip in this city on the inside of the harbor there called Adamas. So this is the opening to port of Milo. So this is basically just north of the town of Adamas. This was the only open crossing we had to do. And it was just like paddling in the bay. You had to kind of do it with some purpose because it's a shipping channel with ferries and freighters and stuff like that. And so basically we set off from here and we went left around that tiny little point of land in a counterclockwise direction. The Mediterranean's a bit like the Sea of Cortez in that you don't really get swell, you get wind waves. So we were really lucky to have incredibly mild winds the entire time we were there, which was 5 or 6 days.
Yeah, this particular photograph actually shows wind waves, but it was taken after the trip. We actually did not have such wind on our trip. We got super lucky. So at the northwest tip of the island is called Cape Vani, and we stopped there and had lunch at an abandoned manganese mine. You can see in the rocks here, it's got a very red hue to it. And basically the manganese deposits formed when hot underwater volcanic fluids, which are rich in metals, forced their way up to the surface through fractures. And it created these veins of manganese that were mined heavily there. Manganese is an important trace element for plants and animals in your diet. And industrially, it's used in production of steel, iron, glass, and batteries. And the manganese mine production started there in 1890, and then it ceased in 1928 due to the global economic crisis.
And fun fact, you can walk into the mine as long as you don't mind mouthfuls of gnats and bats.
It was pretty cool. I liked it. You wanted to say something about this?
So as you can see, there are lots of opportunities for noodling. It's not our dog. And there's lots and lots of slots and really cool features because this is all volcanic. A lot of it's very friable and erodes quickly. And so you just get all these passages all over the place. But as you can see, the water is really calm. So it's a really great place to go exploring if you want to have a Mendo-like experience without sometimes the Mendo-like conditions. So our first campsite was Aegean Agathea. Aegea means saint. And it was this nice little beach. A lot of beaches kind of can be powdery, but as we'll see later, the beaches are actually pretty diverse. This was actually just some person's beach. There's an old couple who kind of is there half the year and they don't care if you camp on the beach. They could probably take better care of their boat. But it was a really nice, very quiet campsite. We decided to pay our guides a little bit extra to prepare our dinners. So it was really much more of a vacation than like a hardcore expedition. So here you see myself, Krista, Brian and Lisa, and then Ian and Tracy from Scotland, having a little bit of wine and some cocktails, as well as snorkeling. Snorkeling started being not great, but it ended up near the end of the trip being amazing.
Yeah, unfortunately, we didn't pay for the extra pixels, so the photos of the guide provided us didn't come out so well.
Yeah, the guide was using a baked potato to take photographs. So on day 2, you can see the color coding here. We made it around the top part of the western side of the island, and now we are going around the southwestern corner. That was a pretty long day. Look at the water. It was hard to sometimes figure out how deep it was because it was so clear. And you can see the striations in the rock above me. And just every time we turned a corner, the rocks changed. So here's a corner where it's mostly white, but it eroded in these pock marks and it's very, very dark underneath. And that variation never stopped the entire time we went around the island. There was basalt as well because because volcanoes. And so this was a stunning corner because we've got this kind of basaltic structure that we're kind of checking out in this big cave. And then right behind it, these kind of ochre and white walls, like the color contrast there were pretty amazing.
This photo here is probably my favorite spot on the entire island. We paddled into this passageway and the entire ceiling was studded with rocks and every rock was a different color. And as you can see, there's thousands and thousands of them, green, blue, red, purple. I've never seen anything like it. I can't wait to go back and visit this cave again. It was just so stunning.
So this is called Sea Kayak Cave. We've paddled into a lot of open ceiling caves all around the world, from Mendo to Thailand, but we've never been in one this big. So this used to be, of course, a tunnel where the roof collapsed. And if we look on the inside, this is what the interior looks like when you hike up the debris on the interior. And it's just this gigantic open clamshell of white rock. And if you look really carefully, you want to point at the boats. That the boats are down there on the beach for scale. And once you're up here, you could actually walk the entire rim of this cave if you wanted to.
Yeah. So this pile here is what used to form the ceiling. Obviously, it's a pile in the middle now, and I think there's a couple people here in the shot for scale. So you basically hiked up this mound and got up onto the rim of the cave. And
it's Greece, so there's other boaters and vacationers and stuff that would come in zodiacs, but no one besides us would stay, much less land. So this is the cave exit looking back out from where we came in, and that was a really neat highlight. So we went to another area on this section called Cleftico, which is just a complete wonderland of caves and passages. All of the rock is soft volcanic ash. We were there in late May, which is considered really early for tourist season. In August, I would stay the heck away. It's just jam-packed, and also it was really hot in early May. I cannot imagine what it would be like in August. It's also worth mentioning, of course, that the water temperature was in the mid-70s. So really nice, really refreshing. Couldn't stay in all day because that's a little bit on the cool side, but it was nice.
Yeah, so you can see the famous turquoise waters here. Very, very popular spot for photography and filming commercials and things like that. And my only disappointment here was that we didn't stop and take a swim in the area because the water was just so clear and stunning. It was gorgeous.
So we're looking at a lot of natural beauty, but there was actually some human-made ruins too, not ancient ones either, that were really neat. So we saw like abandoned and in-use mining and ore structures and objects, and it really reminds you how important mining is to as a lifeblood to this island. This is a freighter, probably like an ore tanker, a loading station that was meant for shipping a kind of clay called bentonite.
So I'm going to give a mini geology lesson here. Basically, when you have volcanic rocks and they're subject to intense hydrothermal activity, they can undergo remarkable changes in composition. And it depends on whether the fluids flowing through them are acidic or alkaline. So the bentonite on Milos was formed by the leaching of the rocks by seawater mixed with hot volcanic alkaline waters. And when the same porous rocks were leached by hot acidic fluids, you basically got a blanket of kaolinite deposited on top of the bentonite. And bentonite, the Greeks and Romans used it for soap, but it's used in the production of iron, fertilizers, pesticides, cosmetics, cat litter. It has really strong colloidal properties, so it swells and creates a viscous gel that becomes less viscous when it's shaken or stirred. So this makes it really useful for foundation engineering for things like bridge pilings and as a sealer in landfills and dams. And we can contrast that with kaolinite, which might sound familiar to you as kaolin. That is used in fine porcelain, paints, house coatings, and production of paper. It's what gives paper whiteness and opacity. And kaolin used to be the active ingredient in kaopectate, which is now pretty much Pepto-Bismol, but back in the day, it used to actually be made with kaolin. So that was the end of our second day.
Yep. So day 3, we're exploring the south and the southeast corner of the island. And is it a highlight or a low light? It depends on your perspective. We paddled through a gigantic butt, which was always entertaining, and came out on the other side relatively unscathed. That was definitely a palm your way through rock, not a paddle your way through.
So this is just more of the scenery. There were some hidden beaches in this area, and we could see people coming down kind of rope ladders to get to the beaches. It was really nice to see them from the ocean side, though. And then we start to see sulfur making its appearance in the landscape here. And this is the geothermal area of Ferlingos. In this area, we started to notice a lot of bubbling and sulfur smell, and the water was getting warmer and warmer from the geothermal activity. And here, what we're seeing in the background behind Nathan is an ancient Roman sulfur mine. They used sulfur for medicinal purposes. It's actually mentioned in the Iliad, and they used it as an antiseptic and fungicide. So they were putting it on their grapes as well as we do in modern times.
And here's one of those mines with a ramp to it. So this is 3,000 years old.
Around 2000.
So that is how they got ore out of the sulfur mine into Roman ships.
Probably using slaves too. So this is a more modern sulfur mine, and this one was started on Milos in 1862.
So at one point, this mine was cranking out, I think, 2,000 tons a year of sulfur. And it was mostly exported to France for use on grapes, but they also use it to make fertilizers, paints, explosives, matches, and fireworks.
And the mine closed in 1958, not because they tapped it out, but because it became so much more cost effective to just produce sulfur by desulfurization of fossil fuels. So there was no longer any reason to actually dig it out of the ground.
And this whole mine area was like a video game level, just ruins that you could explore, and everything was completely rusty, but almost everything was kind of left in place. And this reminded me also of the hospital in Angel Island, actually had a very similar kind of vibe and color palette.
Yeah.
Also reminded me a lot of the ghost town of Bodie, for anyone who's been out there.
Yeah, we spent a couple hours here just touring this mine, so there was a lot to see there. And just near that, just up the coast, was one of our campsites. This is the beach. At the end of every paddling day, we pretty much had time to just lounge around and snorkel. And this spot, I think that's me in the water here. I was kind of swimming out to the offshore rocks because there were thousands of fish in this area. So the snorkeling was getting better and better as we moved around the island.
Not something the Mediterranean is really known for.
Yeah, I was pretty surprised that was the most fish I'd ever seen well, I've only been in the water in the Mediterranean, one other place in Sardinia, but this had way more sea life. Still not a lot of corals or anything interesting like that, like you see in Hawaii, but lots of fish.
So near that beach is this beach is called in an area called Rema, and it's famous for having a bunch of mines for extremely hard rocks used in grindstones and mills. So the Rema beach is also interesting because it's littered with rocks that actually aren't even from this island. It's all ship's ballast from ships coming in to then take the rocks from the for grindstones and millstones elsewhere.
Yeah, so these buildings here were just up this like 2 minutes from our campsite, and they were part of the mine for the millstones. And you can see a millstone here leaned up against one of the windmills on the interior of the island, and we'll show you some more shots of the windmill later on where we actually got to stay inside one.
So then day 4, as you can see now, we're on the East Coast, and we're going to be rounding the northeastern tip around the somewhat large city of Apollonia. So caves, stalactites, beautiful water, that all continued. Again, every time you go around a corner, just the rock shapes just change every mile or so. So it was never ending and endlessly interesting.
Yeah, so right around this section of the island is where they had the desalination plant. And we carried bottled water on the trip. We just put plastic bottles in the boats. The water that the plant produces is potable, but the pipes that deliver it to the houses are pretty old, and it can taste brackish and might even contain lead. They were a bit iffy on exactly what the issues with the water were. If we go again, I would probably bring dromedaries and ask about obtaining filtered water or bring a filter. I don't think there's anything in it. It's not like Mexico where you can get really sick, suddenly from drinking the water. I certainly used it to brush my teeth, and probably drank a little bit of it and didn't get sick. But I think the main issue is probably taste. And if you lived on the island long term, I'm sure you'd want to have filtered water most of the time.
So this is a formation of basalt called the Hermit.
And this is columnar basalt. Other places you can see this, like in California, we have Devil's Postpile, where the columns are much thicker than this. But basically during rapid cooling of a lava flow, you get contractional joints where these fractures can form.
But you can't do this at Devil's Postpile.
That's true. Yeah, we had seen columnar basalt in Iceland, but only when we hiked to the various places. So it was really cool to be able to kayak into these spots. And basically what happens is when the lava is cooling, it can shrink in the vertical dimension without fracturing, but it can't shrink in the horizontal direction unless cracks form. And that's how you get the columns. So here's a spot where we were able to kayak right up to sheer walls of it. And these islands, this set of islands where we are now, it was called the Glarenisia Islands, or Seagull. So there's a neat basalt arch that we paddled through. And then after that, we came to our next campsite.
Yep. This is near a town called Mitakas. And with beaches that are sandy, obviously, sand is a blessing and a curse. But because it's all volcanic ash, this stuff is going to go everywhere, and it's just it's like playa dust if you've ever been to Burning Man. It's not as sticky as alkaline dust, but it is dusty business camping in the hinterlands of Milos for sure. This was a really fun. This is the same campsite, just looking out to the ocean. As you can see, there's this tiny little mouth into this cove, and it was a great place to do a little bit of rolling practice to cool off after a hot day.
Yeah, we didn't snorkel in that spot. We did rolling instead.
So now we're going to take our return to Adamas around the very last leg of our trip, day 5. I'm not even going to pronounce what this place is called, Firapotimos. I think I did that pretty good. Firapotimos is neat because it's churches are everywhere, and Milos has this really interesting architecture, and this is pretty typical of the Aegean side, not so much of the Ionian side, which looks really, really Italian. But almost every single structure is white and blue, like the Greek flag. The entire island is covered in houses and small churches like that one that are exactly those colors. When you get into larger towns, there's a little bit more expressional on the water of different colors and stuff, which are kind of fun.
I think after paddling there for a few days, we realized why the Greek flag is white and blue, because you just have the white cliffs of the islands and the blue of the water, and it all makes sense when you see it.
Yeah, so this is an area called Sarakinico. And Sarakinico is one of these places where once you start to see the rock formations, like if you go to the next slide, if you start looking at like fashion magazines, this is where all of their fashion shoots are held. And so there's these beautiful, almost like Antelope Canyon-like kind of sculpted, scalloped forms, but all pure white. Pretty stunning area. What's interesting about actually, why don't you talk about what that stuff's actually made of?
Yeah, so in this area, you can get about 300-foot depth of diatomite, which if you've heard of diatomaceous earth, it's something that we use at home in our garden for insects. It's highly porous. It's an excellent filtering agent. It can be used as an abrasive in toothpaste. And the way it works as an insecticide is that it scratches the insect's exoskeleton and absorbs lipids from it, and it causes them to dehydrate. For us as kayakers, it translates into a wonderland of caves. And maybe you can see in this previous one, it doesn't show it real well here, but in this area, you got a lot of sunlight bouncing off the water onto the ceilings of the caves, and it just made for a really kind of magical reflections, and just really, really pretty area to paddle through.
And the northernmost tip that we were going around here on day 5 had these rocks that were like Mordor from Lord of the Rings, just really bizarre wind and ocean sculpted shapes. One of the challenges of going to Milos, if you're like me and you like rock gardening, is waiting for waves of any size. So that's Brian Alger in the photograph. Brian and I basically would just be paddling along and we'd break away from the group as soon as we saw a ship of any size going by, and we just wait for the wake to come through. And sometimes we got some great rides, but sometimes we're disappointed.
It's funny because afterwards I went to Google Earth and I was looking at people's photos of the area. So I was trying to remember the names of places we'd been. And I looked at all these photos and there's all these waves, especially coming from the north, because that's the direction the wind usually comes. Now, we had none of that, but it was pretty obvious that this area does get heavily impacted by waves when the wind is up. We just were really lucky not to have that during our trip. Made the circumnav really easy.
Lucky is not the word I would use, but okay.
It was good for the group in general.
So we talked a lot about these kind of beautiful sandy beaches, but boy, there are some beaches you got to land on that are ankle breakers. Like those cobbles, you can see by the scale of it on the with the kayaks in the shot, they're really unstable. Lisa actually took a pretty bad fall, I think, on day 1 or day 2. So you got to be a little bit careful about some of these beaches when you stop for lunch. But then you stop for lunch and you're just hanging out and it's warm and it's gorgeous, and tamarisks everywhere. You can see a tiny little tamarisk bit of foliage in the top of the photo, and because it's so dry there, they're very, very thirsty plants, and so the leaves are always wet as they secrete moisture that they absorb.
Yeah, this was one of these ankle breaker beaches, and I would say most of the beaches on Milos were sandy. Some of them were gravelly. I think we also visited a different island, Kefalonia, and on that one we really struggled with our footwear. Actually, even on Milos, a lot of times you'd land and you'd get very fine pebbles in your shoes. I was wearing Teva sandals, and I kind of wish I'd just been wearing flip-flops in my boat. The weather was too warm, I would say, for any kind of enclosed shoe. I think my feet would have fallen off if I was wearing anything, even with mesh. But having anything that was strapped to your feet just led to rocks getting in there. So I'm definitely going to rethink my footwear before the next time I take a trip like this.
So now we're coming back in towards the port of Milo. So that we're about, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 miles away from Adamas at the end of our trip. And the entrance to this harbor is guarded by 2 large crags called the Bears. I guess it's a bear.
It looks like a mouth.
As you approach it from the north, it totally looks like a bunny rabbit. But anyway, yeah. Well, sure, they're bears. Why not? And then, of course, the colors just keep going. There is a kayak in that photograph for scale. And this was a neat spot because red and white, yeah, sure, but then you get this like shock of green where there's copper in the rocks. So again, just the colors never cease to surprise. So this is Klima, which is one of the last towns we kind of hung out in. And here you can see there's a little bit more color on display, and the big kind of vernacular architecture around the coastline are these buildings that are right at the water's edge. So there's boathouses on the bottom floor, and little kind of vacation homes or cabins up above, kind of like extremely climate vulnerable man caves, basically.
Yeah, so this was one of the last stops on our kayak portion of the trip. Next, we'll be showing you a few land photos. And up in this area of the photo, way up on this hill here, you can see the church. And then you can also see a windmill up on the ridge. So that is where we stayed for a night after the trip. We actually stayed in a refurbished windmill. I think right there you can see the part where the vanes would come off. And this is what the bedroom of the windmill looked like. So it was a very nice place to stay, but again, really, really reasonable costs, like
Yeah.
not that much more than a hotel room.
And
So-
because I'm a sound nerd, yes, the acoustics were really strange.
And this was the view from the patio. It actually had better views on the other side, but this is a nice sunset. So this is the port of Adamas down here. This is close to where we launched from the trip. And after actually that was our last night staying there, but the day before that we did some hiking in this town. This is the town of Tripoli, which means full of holes. And we actually hiked from the town down this hill. Actually, you can see a windmill up here that still has the veins on
Ours
it.
is behind that one.
Yeah, but we hiked down this road into this area and we found the site where the Venus de Milo was found, or maybe we should be pronouncing it Venus de Milo. So the Aphrodite of Milos was found in 1820 by a villager who was doing farm work. And apparently they knew that the left hand was holding an apple, but the left hand and the base are now missing. And of course, the statue's in the Louvre, and there's a plaster cast of it in the museum on Milos. The marble to make that statue did not come from Milos. There's actually no marble on the island. It came from the island of Paros. And this whole area, remember I mentioned it was called full of holes. You have a lot of pumice rock in this area. It's basically rock froth. And one of the uses of pumice is for grinding and polishing ceramics and marble statues, including the Venus de Milo. Another use of that rock is to make catacombs. This was a Christian burial ground in, I think it was the 2nd and 3rd century of the Common Era. And under Roman law, cemeteries were strictly recognized as sanctuaries. So they were used not only for burials, but also for worship and assembly in a relatively protected way. We visited a complex here that had about 291 tombs total. And basically the dead would be placed inside and then they would cover, you can see here a rock slab that could be laid across horizontally, or sometimes they were laid vertically over the holes to seal them up. And another way that this manifests itself is you get these fishing huts. In this case, this is the town of Mandrakia. You basically get these fishing, I like to call them man caves.
These are literal actual man caves.
And they're just built right into the rock. The rock is so porous, you know, the pumice, it's so easy to drill through that you can just make these little fishing huts. These are called spermata. And you can see a couple instances here of probably some fairly ancient ones that have had some doors added to them, but you can tunnel right into the rock there. And this is us on our last day, hiking around Klima, having some good restaurant food and enjoying the sun before we split up and went our separate ways. Lisa and Brian went off to Santorini and Crete, and we went off to do a bit more kayaking on Kefalonia.
Kefalonia was nice too. We can talk to anyone who's curious about Kefalonia. They do not have the outfitters, the outfitting niceties that Milos offers, but there are still some outfitters with pretty good boats. It's also worth noting, if anyone's interested in going, the way the Greek government operates and provides operating licenses for outfitters, they do not allow outfitters to just give gear out and let people go paddle on their own. So you will need a guide if you want to do any multi-day or even single-day paddling there. But if you've never been there before, it's an awfully nice way to get to know the area and get to know a lot more stuff behind the scenes anyway.
Yeah, I was under the impression before we went that there'd be no way to do a self-supported expedition in this area. If you could find a way to get boats there, you probably could, especially on Milos, because there's enough places you could tuck into that are fairly hidden. And, you know, especially if you're not going during the high summer months, it's doable. But yeah, you'd have to figure out a way to get stuff there. And there's pretty much it's a tiny island. So there's one airport and the flights all go through Athens. You can't really fly to Milos from like anywhere in Europe. You pretty much have to go through Athens.
So time to dust off those folders if you want to do it yourself.
So here's the URL for Sea Kayak Milos. We highly recommend them as guides. And I look forward to going back sometime and doing a trip, maybe doing Milos, and there's a couple smaller islands close by that we didn't get to paddle over to, but there's certainly, just a mile or two offshore. So maybe we could go around some of those other islands. So that's all we have for slides, and we could take questions.
Great. If you want to go off screen sharing, then we'll be able to see who's got questions.
All right.
How did you guys handle the poop situation? Did you have to pack everything, or how did it work?
That is a incredibly important question for any sort of camping, right? So yeah, it was wilderness camping. So we did not pack it out, we buried it.
Okay. Close to the water or away from the water?
Away from the water, actually. The way they had us do it is just everywhere on the island that leads to the ocean, there's a wash like you'd find in Mexico. And so you just basically hike up the wash a ways, find a place, and then put a rock on top just to make sure no one else digs there.
Away from the water.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. So they do it away from the water there.
That's
That was how we were
that makes sense.
advised.
Yeah.
Yeah, the main guide left a hammer by his boat, and when you wanted to go do your business, you'd pick up the hammer and take it. And that was
Sometimes you needed the hammer to break the ground too.
And that was, you could use it to dig, but it was also the signal that, like, don't go back in the wash. Hey, Krista, how about not photographing flowers right now in that area? People are doing something back there. So yeah, that's probably why the cost of the trip was relatively low compared to a lot of other things we looked at, because there was no lodging. It was all, you could rent camping gear. We brought our own camping gear because we were also planning to camp on Kefalonia, mostly to save money, but partly because of COVID. We just wanted to be outdoors as much as possible. And that it worked out really well.
I mean, Greece is very low cost coming from the US anyway, whatever you do.
Yeah, and the exchange
Extremely
rate was extremely favorable. The euro to dollar right now was really good. And because we got all our money back when we first made this trip for 2020, and then in 2022 when we went to reserve, it was before the whole war in Ukraine started and all that. So the flights were also pretty reasonable at the time that we booked them. It might not be quite as reasonable now in terms of fuel costs for flying.
Yeah. But yeah, since we did delay the trip due to COVID, it wound up becoming a really kind of COVID safe trip, because even when we were in urban areas, we always ate outside 100% of the time.
Yeah.
Anytime, and we were camping outside almost all the time. When we didn't, we took more of an Airbnb approach with touchless check-in, and we never shared a common area with anyone else because we never stayed in a motel or a hotel. So it wound up, being masked on the plane for 20 hours was fatiguing, but that was the only time we had risks, and we were masked the whole time. So we went through the whole trip and didn't get sick.
I think Beth had a question.
Oh, so how was the food? You guys, were you glad that you had
body weight in cheese? I ate my body weight in cheese.
The food was amazing, and we literally had waiters at restaurants. Like, we'd order stuff and they'd be like, no, order less, and we'd be like, are you sure? We want 4 plates of the mushrooms. And they're like, no, you don't. And then we'd get the plates of mushrooms and it would just be piles of mushrooms.
Yeah,
it was kind of insane.
Big pro tip for anyone who wants to travel to Greece: get ready for the portion sizes. They're insane. They're like American plus size insane, which we were not ready for. We were ready for European scale, and that's not how they roll.
Though, how was the food on the paddle? Were you glad you had the guides cook for you?
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, it was always fresh. It was an interesting challenge, like it's hot every day. You can't keep stuff cold, but you get the right kind of cheese, and we can always have fresh vegetables, and
we had cheese and yogurt. Yogurt actually keeps really well, even if it's warm, as long as the container's sealed. I think we did they even do any resupply? We had maybe one resupply during the trip. We almost ran a little low on water. Like when they told us how much water to bring, we're like, that doesn't sound like enough. So we brought more, And even the more, I think we just were used to drinking a lot of water.
Mhm.
And you know, being very active and snorkeling and paddling. So we went through a lot of water.
But like a lot of places along the Mediterranean, the food style there, of course, is like the dishes are super simple, just the ingredients are killer.
Mhm.
And so it was really good. I've been in the habit of making Greek salads ever since I got home, and I'm still somehow not 1,000 pounds yet. I'm working on it.
Yeah, and they actually accommodated 2 people in the group that were vegans. So it was they were very easygoing about it, and we're really glad that we did it that way. It made it really economical to do lunch and breakfast ourselves, and then just have the dinners prepared. So it was nice.
Oh, also note, just make sure that anyone who's camped in Europe will know this, but if you haven't, just be ready for the fact that gas canisters are different, or are often different. We did bring a jet boil and could find threads that would match, but it was way more common, and most stores have unthreaded European canisters. So you'd want to bring a stove that would match that.
But we didn't end up cooking very. I mean, you made coffee, but we really didn't cook very much. The kind of lunches we had were just, what did we have for lunch? Just we had
Deliciousness. That's all I remember.
Yeah, there was a supermarket in the town where we were staying before the trip, and we just went there and loaded up on yummy. You know, they had those really good canned broad beans, tuna, dolmas. You know, just all kinds of things. You know, in a kayak you can bring whatever you want. You know, weight doesn't matter so much. So there was a lot of yummy food to bring.
I love how the most burning questions after this was pooping and food. I love that.
Did you have any issues with insects, mosquitoes, or anything?
That's a great question.
You know, especially on this island, mosquitoes were pretty minimal. It was pretty arid on Milos, so that wasn't an issue. But there was one campsite where there were actually ticks in the grass, and some got on the tents. A couple got on Nathan. I was off snorkeling, so I had no ticks, and I came back to Nathan going, ticks everywhere. So we had to move the tent a few feet to avoid that, but otherwise it was pretty good. Kefalonia had a few more mosquitoes, but it's much more lush and green there, and it also rained. While we were in Milos, it rained on Kefalonia, but then when we got to Kefalonia, it stopped raining. So we just really lucked out with the weather for some reason.
But yeah, insects on Milos, not a big deal. Ticks you have to watch out for just because there are so many goats on the island. You know how, like, you know, New Zealand and Scotland are both infamous for being overrun by sheep. It's like that, but with goats on Milos.
Oh, and feral cats everywhere.
Oh yeah.
Not so much at our campsites, but in the urban areas. Yeah, cats everywhere.
Did you bring your own paddles, or did you use the outfitter's paddles?
I didn't.
We thought about it, but this outfitter was so good. We used carbon fiber Greenland paddles the entire time.
And on Kefalonia too. Yeah, they had the gear wasn't quite as good, but we managed to get Greenland paddles there as well. So I after paddling in Sardinia, I'd sworn that I would never go anywhere in Europe without my own paddle, but we actually didn't have room in our luggage because we were bringing camping gear. So I didn't, because we could see what they had on the website, and sure enough, the gear was really good. So I think Brian brought his own paddle, but that's because they didn't bring camping gear. They weren't camping for the rest of their trip, so they rented gear from the outfitter. The tents you could rent looked a bit hot and stuffy compared to our own tent that we brought, but otherwise the gear was fine.
So Krista, Nathan, you mentioned you went in May, and the summer probably isn't a good time because of the heat. What about earlier in the spring or during the fall or winter? What do you think?
Good question.
That's a good question. I don't think a lot would be open if you went too early, like during the winter time or this early spring. I would think you'd be hard pressed to find enough restaurants and stuff for supporting, being a tourist. I don't know. You'd have to ask the outfitter, but I don't think they usually run the trips at those times of year. I know they go well into October. But yeah, I would ask the outfitter about timing, and wind is probably more of an issue at some times of year than others. And it's really luck of the draw. You know, we were just really fortunate. If let me see if I can get back to the first.
And one of the benefits, if you do go and the
Oh, we're
wind
not
does
sure.
come up or the weather does deteriorate, Milos is not huge. Like the outfitter will come and like take you from where you were camping and take you to a side of the island that is protected for that next day. So the island's small enough that the outfitter can react to worsening conditions if they do come up. But yeah, we went into several restaurants. I mean, stores are going to be open year round, but we went into several restaurants in late May, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we just opened 2 weeks ago." So going really early season would be fine, probably for a camping expedition if the trips are running. But trying to just kind of get around and just live on the island a little bit before or after could be more challenging.
Yeah, so if the wind did come up, they would just take you to segments of the island where the wind isn't so bad, and you could probably cover most of the island that way. But you'd have a bit less time for snorkeling and things like that if you're having to do car transport. But it's definitely possible for the beaches that they can get to. We definitely were going to some beaches that were very remote, and I guess there were roads into some of them, but I wouldn't want to try to do it in a normal car. Like a
Wait. There's a question in the chat I have to address. No, Ezekiel, I did not need to use any tape on my trip. Okay, now. Happy.
Yeah, I would say Milos is a bucket list kind of place. It's definitely one of the more spectacular places, mostly because just every corner you go around, the landscape changes and it's different every time. I mean, I thought Sardinia was super beautiful, but Milos has more packed in just into such a tiny area. So Genevieve, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. It was a great presentation. I wanted to know, Krista, when you were snorkeling, what kind of sea life did you see?
Just tropical fish, like mostly of the same kind you'd see in Hawaii, I would say. Fish that like to live in warm water. I didn't have any fish identification cards or anything, and actually the outfitter didn't. I had a mask and a snorkel, but they didn't manage to give me the fins, so I wasn't able to dive down too deep to see the fish.
But actually, Genevieve, that's an interesting question. One thing we noticed is that there isn't a lot of marine mammal life there. I saw dolphins for sure twice.
Mm-hmm.
Do
we see any seals?
I don't think we saw a single harbor seal, maybe one.
I think they have monk seals.
Oh, we saw a monk seal. That was neat.
Did we see one?
Yeah, I saw one.
Okay.
That was on Kefalonia, not Milos.
Yeah.
So it was in the Ionian Sea. But so there's not a whole lot of marine mammal life there. And we only saw rich aquatic life on the eastern shore.
Yeah, and like I said, no corals, no clams or like worms and tunicates, not a lot of the whole colorful stuff that you tend to see in more snorkeling based destinations.
They do give their goats pretty strange haircuts. Pretty strange haircuts. I've seen a number of goats with very, very long tresses only on their butts for no apparent reason. They're showy.
Well, I'd like to thank Nathan and Krista for sharing this adventure with us. Something we all aspire to. Thank you so much. I think that this concludes the meeting, and I want to thank everyone who participated tonight. I know it was a packed schedule, but I really appreciate all the contributions. If people want to hang out and chat more with Krista and Nathan, that's fine. But I know many folks have other things to go on to. But thank you again for an excellent presentation.